Welcome back to Goosebump on the Midnight series, where the most terrifying haunted stories are told. Rituals seem to strike a nerve. You. What are you saying? That's absurd. Ivy knew it was useless to ask further at this moment. The woman wouldn't admit anything without undeniable proof. She had to find it herself. After an awkward breakfast, she told Mrs. Kingston that she needed to be alone in the art studio to work. She needed a space of absolute quiet to connect. Mrs. Kingston seemed hesitant, her eyes filled with fear, but eventually agreed. She instructed Mrs. Jeff not to disturb Ivy in any way. This time, Ivy entered the art studio with a clear goal and thorough preparation. She wore a thicker pair of silk gloves, the kind she used when dealing with objects with strong and aggressive taints. She went to the easel. The painting had returned to its original state. The pitch-black streak of tears had vanished without a trace. Scarlett's face had returned to its initial melancholic expression. But the feeling of being watched was still there, even stronger, as if the entity within was growling, challenging her. Ivy didn't dare touch the painting. Touching it now would be like suicide. Instead, she began a silent, meticulous, and patient examination. She was like an investigator at a crime scene, but her scene was a haunted space, and her evidence was the lingering emotions. She went to every corner of the room, touching each object with her gloved hands, closing her eyes, and listening. The paintbrush she guessed she had heard fall last night. She picked it up. Touched it. Boom! A surge of rage and helplessness washed over her. She felt her fingers clenching, devoid of any strength. The urge to pick up the brush and paint, but her hands wouldn't obey. A choked growl in her throat. Throw it away. Useless. A tube of pitch-black oil paint, Mars black. She picked it up. Touched it. An endless emptiness. A dense blackness swallowing everything. Not the black of darkness, but the black of nothingness. Despair. Wanting to use this very black to erase the world, to erase herself, so that only a silent black remained. The wooden chair where Scarlett had probably sat to rest. She placed her hand on the armrest. Piercing, cold loneliness. The feeling of waiting for someone in vain. Waiting for someone who would never come, or someone who had come but brought deceit. A name echoed vaguely in her mind, like an echo from the past. Thorne. Marcus Thorne. Marcus Thorne. Ivy's eyes snapped open. She had heard that name somewhere. A renowned contemporary artist, known for his haunting brushwork, capable of painting the depths of agony. And if she remembered correctly, Marcus Thorne was Scarlett's teacher, the one who discovered and guided her in the early days of her career. A crucial link had appeared. She continued her search, even more meticulously and patiently. She lightly tapped each wooden floorboard, listening for differences in sound. There was one spot, directly beneath the old Persian rug used to cushion the easel, where the tap sounded hollower than elsewhere. She knelt down, lifted the rug. Using a utility knife borrowed from the toolbox, she gently pried into the gap between two floorboards. A wooden board popped up easily, revealing a small, secret cavity carved deep underneath. Inside were no money or jewels. Only a few things that sent shivers down Ivy's spine. A clump of long, silky black hair, neatly tied with a crimson thread. A few burnt-out black candles, their wax melted into strange shapes. A small silver knife engraved with strange characters. And a stack of letters neatly tied with a blue silk ribbon. Most importantly of all, at the very bottom, were 2 old books. The covers were thick, heavy black leather, with no titles, only a 5-pointed star symbol enclosed in a circle embossed on them. Ivy carefully put on another pair of gloves before picking up a book. She turned the old, yellowed pages. Inside were not Vietnamese characters, but ancient Latin script interspersed with astrological symbols and complex, detailed drawings of various rituals. She didn't understand the content, but the drawings of summoning circles, demonic symbols, and figurines pierced with needles, souls extracted and imprisoned in objects, made her shiver. These were books on dark magic. Black magic. She put the book down, her hands trembling slightly. She opened the stack of letters. The handwriting in the first letters was very fluid, flowing, the handwriting of a young girl deeply in love. "My dearest Thorne," one letter began. "I don't know what words to use to thank you. You are not just my teacher, but my whole world. You came and lit up my life, teaching me to see the world through the lens of art. Every day with you is a day I live in a dream." The letters were filled with passionate love, an almost worshipful admiration for a teacher, a lover. But as she read the last letters, written around the time Scarlett fell ill, the handwriting became more shaky, scrawled, full of despair. The very last letter, written on a crumpled piece of paper, the ink blurred by tears, "You promised me, Marcus Thorne. You promised me immortality in art. You said this ritual would merge my soul with the artwork, so my talent would live forever. I believed you. I volunteered. But why? Why do I feel so cold and empty? My hands. My soul. It's not mine anymore. I'm locked in my own work, in the darkness. This isn't art. This is a prison. You lied to me. You created a demon.by me." Ivy dropped the letter, trembling all over. All the pieces had fallen into place in a horrifying way. The artist Marcus Thorne. The teacher, the lover, the one Scarlett worshipped. And the one who performed this dark ritual. Mrs. Kingston had lied. No, she had concealed the most terrifying, most guilty part of the truth. Suddenly, Ivy felt a shadow fall over her. She snapped her head up. There was no one in the room. But the natural light in the room seemed to have dimmed. She looked out the glass window. Dark clouds had appeared from nowhere, obscuring the sun, plunging the entire valley into a gloomy gray. She turned back to look at the painting on the easel. It had changed again. This time it wasn't just a tear or pressed lips. The entire background behind Scarlett, which had been just a pale gray primer, was now swirling with pitch-black streaks like snakes, like tendrils of darkness. Scarlett's face in the painting was distorting in an indescribable agony. Her lips were open, but not to speak, but as if in a terrifying silent scream. And then, the pitch-black shadow she had seen in her first hallucination, it separated from the painting again. This time it was larger, much clearer. It was no longer a vague, shapeless streak. It had taken the form of a distorted, tall, gaunt figure, with no face, only two empty, deep eye sockets like looking into hell. It glided towards Ivy, silently, only the wooden floor creaking under its invisible weight. The whispers echoed in her head again, but this time it wasn't Scarlett's pain, but another voice, cold, cruel, and full of authority. "Get out!" Ivy screamed, frantically grabbing the two books of dark magic and the letters, turning and fleeing the art studio, using all her might to slam the door shut behind her. She heard a loud thud as the shadow hit the oak door. The door rattled violently. She knew she couldn't stay here another second. She had been tricked. She hadn't come here to cleanse a taint. She had walked into the middle of a confrontation between an imprisoned soul and a hidden sorcerer. And she, perhaps, was the next prey. Ivy ran straight down to the living room, her face drained of color, still clutching the incriminating evidence she had just found under the art studio floor. Mrs. Kingston was sitting there on the ivory leather sofa, as if waiting for her. Her eyes couldn't hide her anxiety and restlessness. Seeing Ivy's horrified expression and what she held in her hands, Mrs. Kingston knew she couldn't deny it any longer. It attacked you?" Mrs. Kingston asked, her voice trembling. "Attacked?" Ivy gave a bitter, twisted laugh on her pale face. She threw the two books of dark magic and the stack of letters onto the metal table in front of Mrs. Kingston. The dry clatter echoed in the silent room. "You call that an attack? What's in there isn't a taint, Mrs. Kingston. It's your daughter's soul. Her entire soul is imprisoned in that painting, and it's going mad. What did you do? Who is the painter Marcus Thorne in this story? And what are these things?" Cornered, faced with undeniable evidence, Mrs. Kingston's wall of pride and artificial calm finally crumbled completely. She looked at the books of black magic, at her daughter's desperate letters, then buried her face in her hands and burst into tears. No longer quiet, proud tears. These were broken, raw sobs, full of regret and fear. Amidst her choking sobs, the terrifying truth gradually unfolded, though still distorted through the lens of a mother trying to rationalize her unforgivable guilt. She spoke of Scarlett's cruel neurological degenerative disease, of the extreme despair of witnessing her daughter's prodigious hands grow weaker, tremble, and lose the ability to create precise lines. She spoke of nights when Scarlett screamed in helplessness, smashing things, of the light in her daughter's eyes fading day by day. Just when they were at their most desperate, Marcus Thorne, the teacher whom Scarlett adored and loved, appeared like a savior. He was not only a talented artist but also boasted of having deeply studied Western occult arts, ancient rituals that could infuse vitality and soul into artworks, making them living and immortal. He said it was the only way for her talent not to die with her body. Mrs. Kingston sobbed, her voice cracking. He said he would perform a ritual to dissolve a part of Scarlett's essence, a part of her soul, into her own self-portrait. So she could continue to paint, to live on with art, to become immortal. I was so desperate then. I was blind. I agreed. She recounted that horrifying night, the night they performed the ritual together in the art studio. A stormy night, with black candles, summoning circles drawn with salt and blood, and ancient Latin incantations she didn't understand. Scarlett had willingly participated, believing in Marcus Thorne, believing in a fleeting immortality, an escape for her dying talent. But after the ritual, Scarlett's health did not improve. On the contrary, she rapidly deteriorated, both physically and mentally, as if her vitality had been drained. She passed away just 1 month later. As for Marcus Thorne, after receiving a huge sum of money from Mrs. Kingston, claiming it was for the ritual, he vanished without a trace. Since then, the painting began to exhibit ghostly phenomena, becoming more terrifying each day. I just thought it was a part of her soul being angry because it couldn't find peace, Mrs. Kingston whispered, trying to find a reason to comfort herself. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know it would be this terrible. I didn't know he had deceived both my daughter and me, that he had imprisoned her entire soul. Ivy listened to the entire story, her heart cold as ice. She didn't entirely believe the woman. A mother, no matter how desperate, couldn't be so naive as to believe in such a demonic ritual without a deeper, hidden selfish motive. Perhaps she not only wanted to save her daughter's talent but also to preserve the family's reputation, to keep the painting prodigy she had created. But now was not the time for judgment. She needed to know the true mastermind, Marcus Thorne, who he was and what his real motive was. Leaving White Willow Manor right now was impossible. The storm had truly arrived. Rain poured down, lashing against the glass walls. The wind howled like thousands of tormented souls. Lightning flashed repeatedly across the pitch-black sky. The secluded road leading out of the villa must have been cut off by landslides or fallen trees. She was stuck here. Trapped in a luxurious prison, with a deceitful woman, an enraged soul, and an invisible but extremely dangerous enemy. That night, Ivy locked her room door tightly. She didn't dare to sleep, not even for a second. She dragged a heavy armchair to block the door, an act of psychological reassurance rather than actual defense. She sat on the bed, hugging her knees, trying to organize the chaotic information in her head. Marcus Thorne. He was the key to everything. He hadn't dissolved a part of her soul as he claimed. He had done something far worse. He had bound Scarlett's soul, turning her into a slave, a source of energy. But for what? Just to satisfy a morbid artistic idea? Or was there another purpose? Suddenly, amidst the howling rain and wind, her phone vibrated. The light from the screen startled her. An unknown number, not in her contacts. In a remote place with a raging storm like this, a call was highly unusual. Ivy hesitated, a sense of unease rising. But then, she decided to answer. Hello. Hello, Miss Ivy. A deep, magnetic, and charming male voice echoed from the other end of the line. The voice had a strange allure, demanding attention. But to Ivy, behind that charm was a falseness and a deadly coldness. Even though she had never heard it before, she knew who it was. Marcus Thorne. She asked, her voice full of caution. Glad you still remember my name, he chuckled softly, a self-satisfied and controlled laugh. I guess you had a rather interesting day at White Willow Manor. Did that poor mother tell you her tearful fairy tale yet? What did you do to Scarlett? Ivy cut straight to the chase, without preamble. Me. I gave her a gift. An immortality that every artist in this world yearns for, Marcus Thorne said, his voice filled with morbid philosophy. But perhaps you and that old woman aren't sophisticated enough to understand true art. She thinks I just borrowed a part of her daughter's soul to add depth to the work. How naive. Who builds a nuclear power plant just to light a bedside lamp? Ivy shivered at his cruel comparison. Power plant? What do you mean? Scarlett, while alive, was a prodigy. But that talent was limited by a mortal, sick, and weak body. I freed her. I distilled her entire soul, her talent, and most importantly, her extreme despair at not being able to paint anymore, into that canvas. I created an immortal, soul medium. An endless source of creative energy. A spiritual battery, if you prefer a more mundane term. Ivy could hear him smiling triumphantly through the phone. That painting is her prison, and at the same time, my lifeblood. Whenever I create, anywhere in the world, I can connect with it and draw energy from it. The greater her pain, the deeper her despair, the more my creativity flourishes. My recent works have been praised endlessly by international critics, you know. They call it the depth of agony expressed through color. How poetic. The blood in Ivy's veins turned to ice. This man's cruelty surpassed anything she could have imagined. He wasn't just imprisoning a soul. He was tormenting it daily, hourly, turning the pain of someone he once loved into fuel for his career and fame. You monster, she hissed through clenched teeth, her voice full of loathing. Art always demands sacrifice, my young lady, Marcus Thorne replied nonchalantly. And now, I think you've interfered too deeply in my affairs. Initially, I intended to let my muse deal with you herself, but it seems you're more stubborn than I thought. So, let me give you a taste of my art. What are you going to do? Ivy screamed, a bad premonition washing over her. You have a special ability, don't you? To touch and feel. A wonderful gift. But any gift can become a curse. I will help you unleash it. Good night, Ivy. He hung up. Immediately, Ivy felt a horrifying change in her own body and perception. Her ability, the thing she had spent her entire childhood and youth learning to suppress, to control, suddenly exploded out of control. She no longer needed to touch anything. The taints of every object in this luxurious room simultaneously attacked her. The bed screamed of loneliness, sinful desires, silent tears of hundreds of guests who had slept on it. The walls whispered of arguments, lies, buried secrets. The floor groaned under the weight of thousands of footsteps, of weariness, of haste. The entire room transformed into a chaotic symphony of millions of fragmented, overlapping emotions. Ivy's head throbbed as if it would explode. She covered her ears tightly, but it was useless. The sounds didn't come from outside. They came from within, from her own amplified ability. She looked up, and let out a horrified scream. The world around her was no longer made of shapes and matter. It was melting, transforming into colors. Overlapping, chaotically blending emotional streaks. The floor was stained with a murky green of deceit, like sewage. The walls were streaked with bright red of anger. The armchair bled a dreary gray of boredom and despair. Marcus Thorne had used his dark magic to amplify her ability to the extreme, turning her gift into the most terrifying instrument of mental torture. Hallucinations began to appear. The white bougainvillea flowers outside the window were no longer flowers. They transformed into thousands of skeletal, pale hands, beckoning her, scratching frantically at the glass. The floor beneath her feet turned into a giant canvas, and fresh blood and oil paint oozed from the wood grain, creating a gruesome painting of pain. Ivy cowered in the corner of the room, her mind on the verge of collapse. This was Marcus Thorne's attack. He wanted to torture her to death, or to madness, from afar. In her extreme panic, as her sanity was about to be engulfed, she suddenly remembered Scarlett's words in her last letter. "You made a demon.by me." No, Ivy thought, a last flicker of reason. "You won't turn me into your victim." She had to fight back. But how? She had no magic, no weapons, nothing. And then, she realized. Her only weapon was this very ability. It was the gift that was tormenting her. If he could amplify it, she could also focus it. She closed her eyes tightly, ignoring the hallucinations and the frantic colors dancing before her. She tried to ignore all the miscellaneous taints, the chaotic emotions of the objects around her. She focused her entire mind, her entire consciousness, on a single source of emotion. The strongest, darkest, and most painful source of emotion in this house. Scarlett's pain. She directed her entire focus towards the art studio at the end of the hallway. She deliberately opened herself up, letting the despair, the rage, the loneliness of the imprisoned girl flood her. She didn't fight it. She empathized with it. She became it. And she used that very horrific pain as a shield. The hallucinations created by Marcus Thorne began to fade. The chaotic colors gradually receded. Because no artificial pain, no borrowed anger he could create, could compare to the true agony of a soul that had been tormented and imprisoned for an entire year. Scarlett's pain was a storm, while Marcus Thorne's illusions were merely a passing breeze. Ivy gasped, her back soaked with sweat. She had repelled his mental attack. But she knew this was just the beginning. Marcus Thorne would not give up easily. He would come here. He would definitely come here. He would come to reclaim his soul medium, or to silence those who knew his secret. And she had to be ready for the final battle. The storm outside grew even more furious. Wind whistled through the cracks in the doors, creating sounds like the cries of a wounded beast. Lightning repeatedly tore across the pitch-black sky, illuminating the pine trees struggling in the wind, and the sea of white bougainvillea in the yard being battered mercilessly. White Willow Manor shook as if it were about to collapse under the wrath of nature, as if nature itself was raging on behalf of the tormented soul within it. Ivy knew her time was running out. Marcus Thorne was coming. The phone call and the mental attack earlier were just a prelude, a declaration of war. He wanted to break her down, to drive her to panic before he officially appeared to deliver the final blow. She couldn't sit here and wait to die. She had to counterattack. But what did she have? Nothing, except her special empathy and the painful fragments of truth. How could she fight a sinister sorcerer, someone who used the souls of others as weapons and sources of energy? She suddenly remembered the letters, and Scarlett's early works that Mrs. Kingston had regretfully mentioned. The paintings from when she was a little girl, when her talent first blossomed, when she painted with pure joy. An idea flashed in Ivy's mind, crazy and fragile as a thread in a storm, but it was the only hope she had. If Marcus Thorne used pain, despair, and hatred, negative emotions, to bind and control Scarlett's soul, then the only thing that could counteract it, neutralize it, must be its complete opposite: joy, hope, and pure, innocent love for art. She had to awaken the human part left within Scarlett's soul, before it was completely turned into a devil. She flung open her room door and ran down to the living room. Mrs. Kingston was huddled on the white leather sofa, her face gray with fear, clutching a pillow as if for comfort. "Mrs. Kingston," Ivy called, her voice sharp and urgent, devoid of fear, only determination. "Listen to me. Marcus Thorne is on his way here. He's not coming to talk, he's coming to complete the ritual, to drain your daughter's entire soul and silence us. We don't have much time. So what do we do?" She stammered, her eyes wide with panic. "Call the police." "What can the police do about this?" Ivy dismissed decisively. "They'll think we're crazy. It's just us. You, me, and Scarlett too. Now, do exactly what I say. Where are Scarlett's first paintings, the ones she made when she was happy, before she met Marcus Thorne?" Mrs. Kingston looked bewildered, not understanding why Ivy would ask about such things in this desperate situation. But Ivy's determination and fiery gaze compelled her to comply instinctively. She led her to a storage room in the basement, filled with old memorabilia. She opened a large wooden chest, inside of which were Scarlett's childhood works. These were watercolors, charcoal drawings, pastels, depicting incredibly simple and innocent things: a wild flower just blooming in the garden, the neighbor's calico cat curled up basking in the sun, morning sunlight slanting through the window, a fruit platter. The brushstrokes were still somewhat naive, the technique not yet perfect, but they were full of life, joy, and a pure, uncalculating love for painting. They were purify energy. They were the purest light in Scarlett's soul. "Bring all of them to the art studio," Ivy commanded, her voice allowing no hesitation. "Quickly." The two women, one old, one young, hurriedly carried the stacks of paintings up to the second floor. When they opened the art studio door, a chaotic scene met their eyes. Wind from a broken window somewhere had swept in, tearing white canvases, knocking over solvent bottles, spilling paint everywhere on the floor. The portrait on the easel had now completely transformed. Scarlett's beautiful face had vanished entirely, covered by a furious, pitch-black vortex, constantly swirling like a cosmic black hole. The evil black shadow had merged with the painting, turning it into a living gateway, a spatial crack leading to a hell of torment. It growled, emitting horrifying sounds, a mix of scraping metal and the wails of a tormented soul. "Place them around the easel," Ivy instructed, though her heart was pounding erratically in her chest. "Form a circle." Mrs. Kingston trembled as she complied. She placed the colorful and light-filled paintings around Marcus Thorne's demonic masterpiece. Just then, the main art studio door burst open. A thunderous crash. Wind and rain lashed inward, chillingly cold. A tall figure, wearing a long black trench coat, stood rigidly in the doorway, silhouetted against the flashing lightning outside. The artist Marcus Thorne. He looked exactly as Ivy had imagined, but even more terrifying. Around his early 40s, with an angular, diabolically handsome face, his hair meticulously styled despite being soaking wet. And his eyes glowed with a frantic fire of creativity and cruelty. "A warm welcome indeed," he said, his voice chillingly calm, despite the storm howling behind him. He glanced at the childish paintings laid out on the floor, then sneered contemptuously. "How touching. Do you intend to use these naive strokes to fight against my masterpiece, girl? What you created isn't a masterpiece." Ivy screamed, trying to be heard over the storm's roar. "It's an abomination. A prison. A vicious act of parasitism." Different perspectives, Marcus Thorne shrugged, leisurely stepping inside, slamming the door shut. He raised a hand towards the screaming portrait. "Come now, my muse. Don't be angry anymore. It's time for us to finish. Give me all that you have left." The painting let out a soul-rending scream. The black vortex on the canvas spun wildly, a thick surge of dark energy shot out, hurtling towards Marcus Thorne. But he simply raised his hand, and the energy obediently wrapped around his arm like a pet returning to its owner. He was its master. He controlled it completely. He turned to look at Ivy, his eyes gleaming with cruelty. "And now you. I will give you the honor of being the final audience for the birth of another masterpiece, created from your very own energy." Another surge of black energy from the painting shot directly towards Ivy. But this time, she was ready. She didn't run. She did something Marcus Thorne could never have anticipated. She closed her eyes, ripped off her gloves, and pressed both of her bare hands onto the surface of the demonic canvas. Feeling. A torrent of pain and emotion crashed down, engulfing Ivy's entire consciousness. All of Scarlett's despair, rage, loneliness, paralysis, and physical agony from an entire year of imprisonment surged directly into her mind, without any filter. She felt as if she herself was bound in a pitch-black, endless space. Her limbs couldn't move, her mouth wanted to scream but no sound would come out. She felt every time Marcus Thorne drained her energy, a sensation like thousands of hungry leeches gnawing at her soul, leaving behind an extreme emptiness and coldness. The agony, both physical and mental, was so intense that she almost dissolved, her consciousness on the verge of merging with that chaos. But she didn't let go. She gritted her teeth, accepting all those emotions. She embraced that pain, not to fight it, but to understand it, to share it. "Scarlett!" She screamed in her mind, an unspoken scream that reverberated in the spiritual realm. "I know you're still in there. Remember. Remember why you started painting. Not to be immortal. Not for fame or for anyone else. But because you loved it. Remember the sunlight. Remember the calico cat. Remember the joy of finishing a painting." Ivy used her own ability, not just to feel, but to transmit. She transmitted the pure, warm memories and emotions she had just read from the old paintings, directly into the storm of hatred. Like dropping a single drop of clear water into a glass of thick black ink, a seemingly hopeless effort, but she gave it her all. The painting began to shake violently, The black vortex on the canvas started to waver. Its screams became confused, torn between two opposing emotions, dark hatred and bright memories. It was distracted. The link between it and Marcus Thorne began to weaken. Marcus Thorne was stunned. He couldn't believe his eyes. "You! What are you doing?" Impossible. He had never seen anyone able to interfere with his soul medium like this. That was the moment Mrs. Kingston had been waiting for. Her belated remorse and boundless maternal love finally gave her the courage she had never had. Seeing Marcus Thorne and the entity in the painting completely focused on Ivy, she quietly picked up a sharp canvas knife from the tool table. "I want my child to be free," she whispered, tears streaming down her face, ravaged by grief. "Even if she vanishes forever." With a determined scream, a mother's scream to protect her child, she lunged and cut a decisive diagonal line across the painting. The dry tearing sound of the canvas resonated, like skin being peeled from bone. The painting convulsed violently. A piercing scream echoed, but this time, it was no longer the growl of a demon, but the agonizing cry of a young girl. And then, Mrs. Kingston did the last thing. She snatched the still-burning storm lantern from the windowsill, a utility item for power outages, and without hesitation, hurled it directly at the freshly slashed painting. The flame met the kerosene and oil paint, erupting violently, consuming the canvas imbued with resentment. "No!" Marcus Thorne shrieked in horror as he watched his power plant, his lifeblood, engulfed in flames. A massive, chaotic burst of energy was suddenly unleashed from the burning painting. It was all of Scarlett's resentment, pain, and hatred no longer confined within the canvas. But it didn't dissipate into the air. Resentment has a source, and debt has an owner. That surge of energy, like an invisible vortex, attacked no one else. It turned back and struck the one who created it. Marcus Thorne was thrown backward, his back hitting the glass wall, causing it to crack like a spiderweb. He didn't die. Fate had reserved for him a punishment more cruel than death. His eyes, once gleaming with arrogance and cruelty, now became empty, soulless. He slumped to the floor, staring blankly into space, his hands beginning to move unconsciously, drawing meaningless circles in the air. Eyes. The eyes. He mumbled, drooling. The background color is wrong. It needs to be darker. More pain. Even darker. He had been consumed by his own morbid artistic obsession. All of Scarlett's resentment didn't kill him, but imprisoned him forever in an endless creative madness. His mind had been destroyed. The fire slowly died down, leaving only the burnt easel and a pile of ashes on the floor. From within the thin smoke, Ivy saw the blurry figure of a young girl in a white dress appear. Scarlett. Her soul looked back at her mother, Mrs. Kingston, who was kneeling on the floor, her eyes no longer filled with hatred, only forgiveness and an immense sadness. Then she looked at Ivy, nodding slightly, a meaningful nod of gratitude. Her figure slowly faded, dissolving into the air, like morning mist. Her soul had finally found true peace. Ivy collapsed to the floor, completely exhausted, both physically and mentally. She had survived. But when she opened her eyes to the world around her, she knew she had changed. Forever. Marcus Thorne was stunned, he couldn't believe his eyes. You. What are you doing? Impossible. He had never seen anyone able to interfere with his soul medium like this. That was the moment Mrs. Kingston had been waiting for. Her belated remorse and boundless maternal love finally gave her the courage she had never had. Seeing Marcus Thorne and the entity in the painting completely focused on Ivy, she quietly picked up a sharp canvas knife from the tool table. "I want my child to be free," she whispered, tears streaming down her face, ravaged by grief. "Even if she vanishes forever." With a determined scream, a mother's scream to protect her child, she lunged and cut a decisive diagonal line across the painting. The dry tearing sound of the canvas resonated, like skin being peeled from bone. The painting convulsed violently. A piercing scream echoed, but this time, it was no longer the growl of a demon, but the agonizing cry of a young girl. And then, Mrs. Kingston did the last thing. She snatched the still-burning storm lantern from the windowsill, a utility item for power outages, and without hesitation, hurled it directly at the freshly slashed painting. The flame met the kerosene and oil paint, erupting violently, consuming the canvas imbued with resentment. "No!" Marcus Thorne shrieked in horror as he watched his power plant, his lifeblood, engulfed in flames. A massive, chaotic burst of energy was suddenly unleashed from the burning painting. It was all of Scarlett's resentment, pain, and hatred no longer confined within the canvas. But it didn't dissipate into the air. Resentment has a source, and debt has an owner. That surge of energy, like an invisible vortex, attacked no one else. It turned back and struck the one who created it. Marcus Thorne was thrown backward, his back hitting the glass wall, causing it to crack like a spiderweb. He didn't die. Fate had reserved for him a punishment more cruel than death. His eyes, once gleaming with arrogance and cruelty, now became empty, soulless. He slunk to the floor, staring blankly into space, his hands beginning to move unconsciously, drawing meaningless circles in the air. Eyes. The eyes. He mumbled, drooling. The background color is wrong. It needs to be darker. More pain. Even darker. He had been consumed by his own morbid artistic obsession. All of Scarlett's resentment didn't kill him, but imprisoned him forever in an endless creative madness. His mind had been destroyed. The fire slowly died down, leaving only the burnt easel and a pile of ashes on the floor. From within the thin smoke, Ivy saw the blurry figure of a young girl in a white dress appear. Scarlett. Her soul looked back at her mother, Mrs. Kingston, who was kneeling on the floor, her eyes no longer filled with hatred, only forgiveness and an immense sadness. Then she looked at Ivy, nodding slightly, a meaningful nod of gratitude. Her figure slowly faded, dissolving into the air, like morning mist. Her soul had finally found true peace. Ivy collapsed to the floor, completely exhausted, both physically and mentally. She had survived. But when she opened her eyes to the world around her, she knew she had changed. Forever. The storm had passed, leaving White Horse Mountain with a breathtakingly clear sky. White Willow Manor, the villa tainted with injustice, was quickly sold at a bargain price. It was rumored that Mrs. Kingston had dissolved all her galleries and companies, used almost all her assets for charity, and then retreated to a small temple in a secluded rural area, living out the rest of her life in repentance and solitude. No one ever saw the prodigy artist Marcus Thorne again. But some time later, the art world buzzed about a mad, filthy beggar who often sat in a corner of the city's central park. He didn't beg for food or speak, he only used scraps of charcoal he found to repeatedly draw thousands of empty, pained eyes on the cement ground. Ivy returned to Time's Mark antique shop, returning to Mr. Martin's caring embrace. She still lived her quiet life as before, still wearing gloves to protect herself. But one thing had changed forever. The price she paid for directly confronting and absorbing a part of a tormented soul was that her ability had been permanently transformed. She no longer just felt the imprints. Now, she saw them. The world in her eyes was no longer normal. Everyone, everything was surrounded by emotional auras, overlapping, constantly moving streaks of color. She saw deceit as murky green like sewage, sadness as transparent blue like ice, anger as fiery red like blood, love as warm pink, and peace as pale yellow like sunlight. Her world had become a giant, living, and sometimes chaotic, surreal painting. That was her new curse. A constant reminder of the horrifying night at White Willow Manor. But Ivy no longer ran. She accepted it. She learned to live with the colors of devils and angels that only she could see, learning to filter out unnecessary information so as not to go insane. Sometimes, on a quiet late afternoon, she would sit in the shop, take off her silk gloves, and gently touch an old object. Not to seek pain or drama, but to remind herself that, no matter how terrifyingly stained the world might be with colors, somewhere there always existed a pure white of sacrifice, a pink of love, and a warm yellow of hope. And sometimes, just a little bit of that bright color was enough to disperse a vast area of darkness. Thank you all for your interest and for listening to the channel story. Please support the channel by liking the video if you found it good, commenting your thoughts on the story and the ending, sharing this video with friends and family, subscribing and hitting the notification bell so you don't miss the next thrilling horror stories. Thank you all for watching.